Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our battle of the wits, which we have titled The Best Possible Way to Discuss Seed and Science. Which is your best option? This battle is hosted by Seed World. It is for the ISF Virtual Congress of 2021. My name is Marcel Bruins, and I will be your referee for today. As I said, we will have a battle of the wits with on one side of the ring, David Zaruk, professor at Odyssey University College in Brussels, Belgium, environmental health risk analyst and risk communications consultant. And on the other side of the ring, we will have Kevin Folta, professor at the University of Florida in the US, host of Talking Biotech and science communicator. Gentlemen, we are surrounded by science skeptics. And it's not just isolated to Europe, where I live, but in my view, it is everywhere. And I'm sure with Kevin in Florida and David in Zaruk, we will hear much more about that global conundrum. And today in our Battle of the Wits, we will be taking a deep dive into the common questions and misconceptions that consumers have about agriculture, but not just about agriculture, also about probably the single most important building block of agriculture, namely seed. Kevin, you will help share how you address these questions and even, fill us in on what could be the wrong way to talk about a certain issue. And David, you will let us know if you agree with Kevin and how you address things differently in Europe, given your much more European audience.
Well, I can tell you how I do things incorrectly because I did it for probably 25 years. And that was just by piling on more information to people who had questions. It wasn't about the important parts of why technology matters. I would just simply talk about what technology is and how it works. And really the effective strategy is to identify what is the common ground between you and somebody with concerns, between you and a skeptic. And when you find the common ground, whether it's food security, environmental issues, or just making sure that people in the industrialized world have better choices, that's the place to start. And from there, you can begin to have productive conversations.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. David, you agree?
Yes, I think you have to know where your audience is coming from as well. Not everyone shares the same concerns. Not everyone shares the same feelings towards the consequences. And you're dealing with risk-taking in many cases. You're dealing with risk-taking that's going inside of somebody's body. So it is actually a very personal relationship with them. And people have completely different attitudes towards risk today, including at the policy level. I'm not just talking about my sister-in-law. I'm talking about regulators in Brussels. And they may see risks within different contexts completely than how a scientist may see it or how a person, a consumer in a shop will see it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I believe, David, your sister-in-law, Rachel, I believe is her name, is quite famous, isn't it?
Yes, I don't know if she realizes how well known she is, but she is one of those, what I call a naturopath, who clearly has found knowledge. She has a PhD from Google University, and she has informed herself on everything she needs to know in a way that she can answer to any question that anyone may have. She's quite an interesting person, especially around the table at Christmas time.
I think everyone has a Rachel at a Christmas dinner or at any anniversary or wedding. Kevin, I'm sure you have one or more Rachels in your close vicinity.
Oh yeah, same thing. But that is really a challenge. And that's something that all of us that are interested in the issues around food and farming need to be prepared to confront. And too many times it becomes contentious. It becomes confrontational in a really negative way. And the easy way to get there is maybe to remember that when you're communicating in a public situation, like even around the dinner table, that your audience isn't Rachel. Your audience is everyone else who's watching, who's curious who to trust. Is it you or is it Rachel? And by being kind, by being respectful, by identifying those common areas amongst everybody, or taking a good guess anyway, and appealing to those, is how we can change their hearts and mind if they're on the fence and have more influence than Rachel will.
It's frustrating, though, because Rachel has a very good communication network. And she's very passionate about getting her message out. And there are certain times when just really, it's very hard to stay professional because you know that what she's saying is nonsense, but and people believe it.
Absolutely true. I find it hard to keep my patience, but I bet we're all wrestling with that. And one of the topics that is under fire is, of course, the new breeding techniques, where a lot of the research is funded by private companies, obviously. And so we have heard a lot of activists who are accusing those scientists of cooking data just to serve a specific goal. And I wanted to ask the two of you, does this happen? And how should experts address such a question from the concerned Rachels? Kevin?
Well, to me, I start out by thinking about even calling it new breeding techniques. To me, as a person who understands plant genetic improvement, they're not really breeding techniques as much as just general plant genetic improvement. These have much more precision. And so when we're speaking to the public about them, we need to be sure to talk about that precision compared to other traditional breeding techniques. I'm not a fan of believing that companies cook the data, because it would be too easy to identify that they cooked the data. And there are hundreds of independent scientists, other companies, other interests around the world, regulators who look at these things very carefully. And especially when you look at companies and their competitors, everybody would like to catch their competitor in a mistruth to erode the trust in their products. At the end of the day, if it works for farmers and performs in the field as expected, that is the way in which companies earn the trust. And that's how you know that they're telling the truth about their products and their services.
I think the term cooking the data itself is a scientific problem in general, and science is designed, the methodology is designed to always challenge and attempt to catch, not necessarily where the data is cooked, but perhaps where there are simple mistakes somewhere in the process. So the scientific method is designed to deal with that. However, it's not only an industry issue. I frequently, if we look at, for example, ClimateGate, from a decade of climate science was put on a shelf because certain scientists in the academic world were less than forthcoming with some of the negative data. I coined the term activist science, where rather than starting with the data and coming to a conclusion, they start with the conclusion and look at evidence that will suit it. So we see that NGO-funded science also sometimes can be called to question for that. So when we say only industry cooks the data, as Kevin said, this is very easy to catch, and industry in particular, more than anyone else, is under the microscope very intensely. I worked for many years in a corporate research center, and we have very strict policies in place, because if we were ever cooking the data, our stock price would collapse. The CEO would likely have to resign. There was a lot on it. We never publicly announced whenever there were discipline actions, but we took very strong actions to make sure it didn't happen. So people who go around saying that it's industry cooking the data and, putting in an M in front of every word as an adjective, are A, acting unethically, and B, showing their ignorance. They really don't know what's going on.
Staying a little bit on the topic of the new breeding techniques, they have come heavily under fire in the EU, and that is, of course, in very stark contrast with the US, where the use of new breeding techniques is very much more accepted. David, tell us what's going on in the EU. What are the biggest concerns you're hearing?
Well, first of all, we have to understand the context. If we go back to I think it's now 2 years ago, the decision of the European Court of Justice to consider them under the regulatory framework of the 2001, what's commonly known as the GMO directive, which essentially made it almost impossible to bring new products onto the market through any type of gene editing process. These claims were brought to the European Court of Justice, in particular by 5 French nonprofits and peasant organizations. And they were particularly concerned about the fact that there were several breeding techniques that could bring about herbicide-resistant seeds onto the market, not genetically modified, but and the organic lobby is very concerned about particularly the growth of conservation agriculture techniques, no-till farming, and complex cover crops that could, so the herbicide resistance is a very soft spot for the organic agricultural sector. So they've been fighting very hard on this to maintain their positive elements to soil management over the conventional farming techniques. So the context was quite simple. It was brought to the court because of this. They even put it in the claim that they were very concerned about herbicide-resistant seeds. That was in the case that they brought forward. So the context itself clearly showed the motivation. The decision of the court was based only on what legislation was available, and there was no other legislation available. And unfortunately in Brussels, because of the emotion, it was too difficult to introduce new legislation. Now, fast forward 2 years, we now have the Green Deal, and particularly the farm to fork strategy, where they're looking at taking, more or less cutting pesticide use by 50%, as well as fertilizer use by 2030. Well, this is going to lead to a severe decline in yields. So at that point now, the context has shifted. And it's created an opportunity. And suddenly you begin to hear debates starting up about maybe we should bring in new legislation which will not only allow in a more market-friendly manner different seed breeding technologies, but also bring in legislation. And we're going to see the usual suspects coming forward to stop this. But I think we know quite simply that new seed varieties, well, there are several studies. One showed 50% of all increased agricultural yields. Another study showed 85% of all agricultural yield increases came from new seed developments or seed breeding technologies. So this is going to change the landscape. So the context is important to consider in this situation.
Absolutely. Kevin, how would you address the concerns that David just outlined?
Well, David really outlines it well, but my colleagues in Europe, my scientific colleagues, my heart goes out to them. They've come up with innovations to solve problems for European farmers that they will never see used. And it breaks my heart because, these are people who have their hearts in the right places, working in government laboratories or in government academic institutions who are working for European farmers. Yet those technologies will not hit the road because of political decisions. So here in the States, things are going well, that if you can demonstrate that the changes that are made are consistent with what can happen through a natural process, they're not viewed as a regulated item. And that's probably the better way to do this. It still is tested, still looked at carefully, because you don't need a collateral effect popping up. That was unintended. So they guard against that. Every lab is doing it. It's a great technology, and we're seeing everything from agriculture to medicine affected by positive changes using gene editing technologies. It's a really exciting time.
I think if I can add to that, it's not only a US versus Europe situation. In particular,
my mic is
you don't need large companies to fund this research. In many cases, we're finding in African labs that they're able to solve issues on cassava or on banana wilt, and they're able to do so, for local farmers with local solutions. But this sort of preconception that this is all big industry trying to control the market, in particular with the social justice wing of the agroecologists trying to ban these technologies in Africa, and the concern among African exporters that they will not be able to export to Europe. It's impoverishing, the next generation of African farmers. This is a serious issue.
Absolutely. You're right, David. Often from unexpected corners, we find beautiful solutions and innovations coming forward, also from labs outside of Europe and the US, absolutely. Another dossier that has been heavily under fire is, of course, the Neonic dossier. It has come under fire, the use of neonics, because of the perceived impact on pollinator health. And they were often found, of course, in seed treatments. My question to you is, does the good that this insecticide does for growers, does it outweigh the bad? Kevin.
Yeah, so for me, it's important when we communicate about these things is to be absolutely clear that neonics are insecticides and they have to be used carefully and within the proper limits in order to minimize risk to insect populations. The good part about this, when I communicate about neonics, is that they only affect the organisms that consume the plant when used properly. So it means that everything else is safe from application of broad aerial spectrum application. And that's true for whether broad application, whether you're talking conventional or organic control. Plus, it doesn't have to be continuously applied. So these are some of the real strengths of that kind of technology. And when we're communicating, we have to do it with that kind of honest approach. I think when we do, it gets a little more buy-in. It's very easy to say anything that ends in aside is something that people want to get rid of. Yet it's important to remember that chemistry can be used safely, and we get better at using it all the time. The practices that were here a decade ago have been further refined, and these things can be used safely and in a context that limits their risk to natural populations.
Yeah. David, did we take the wrong decision on neonics?
Yes, I mean, I've been involved in particular with the whole debate that started. In fact, I think the word B-gate has been attributed to some of the documents I released. And it's frustrating to see that probably one of the most advanced technologies out there has been so vilified. But once again, context has to be considered. Why has there been such a concerted move to get neonics off the market, in particular the seed treatment approach? And the problem, I think, about seed treatment, I mean, that's the benefit, is that you're not, using large amounts of foliar sprays and just, wiping out every possible insect, beneficial or not, that's going to be inside that, as well as other elements of environmental harm, of putting more pesticides into the environment than necessary. The seed treatment approach goes against the integrated pest management philosophy as understood by a lot of the green actors in Brussels, who look at IPM as a first step in banning all pesticides. Whereas farmers would look at IPM from a position of being able to guarantee the most sustainable approach. And so when the anti-neonic activists would see any seed treatment, to be honest, but particularly with the neonics being used, you're not using it only when necessary. You're using it as a preventative measure at time of planting, and that goes against their philosophy of where they want to see pesticide use continue. So they would rather see more pesticides sprayed and being less effective. And in fact, also seeing fewer crops in rotation, because if we see what's happened since the ban in Europe, the amount of oilseed rape, which is what canola is here, is gone down dramatically, and is, and also sugar beets was also being pulled from rotation until the French government decided to temporarily remove the ban on neonics for sugar beets. So it comes down to whether IPM is well understood, and there's different interpretations of what this means and what the goal or the long-term objective is of such an approach.
Yeah, absolutely true. And the interesting fact is that with the decline in oilseed rape in Europe, the beekeepers have run out of nectar for the bee population. So the beekeepers are asking for the return of neonics, so that
it's the first nutritional source that a lot of the bees that have been overwintering, and a lot of the deaths happen particularly from the very harsh cold winters that we've had.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay, so now we may see a clash of opinions here. We're going to talk about the precautionary principle. And of course, this is a principle that is used a lot and often heard when talking about GMOs in food. Kevin, David, what are your thoughts on the precautionary principle? Is it a wise choice, or does it just inject fear and caution? First, Kevin.
Well, to me, the precautionary principle is all about relative risk. In other words, my precautions may not be the same level as the things that concern somebody in Europe, or someone who concern, or a farmer who's a subsistence farmer in Africa. If to me, or to it all depends upon your frame of reference and the context. And so you have to be very careful about your level of risk framing the decisions that others have to live with. So for me, I'm much less concerned about precaution and more concerned about case by case, careful evaluation of risk in individual circumstances, individual products, individual sets of genetics in their appropriate context, how they'll affect people, how they'll affect the environment. And that has to be done on a case by case basis.
David?
Well, precaution is being used in Brussels in particular as a tool to essentially handcuff a lot of regulatory processes. Now, first of all, we have to understand that there are different definitions, many definitions of precaution. The original one that was widely used was the one established by the Brundtland Commission, which was part of the move towards Rio, the Earth Summit in Rio in '92, which was the famous triple negative. Just because you're not certain that something, that the science is not certain on something, is not a reason, second negative, to not act, in particular about climate change, when there was still skepticism about climate change. Actually, you could take that one as well and justify why we must have more implementation of GMOs as well. So actually that precautionary principle works very well. Just because we're not certain about the safety and the science on GMOs, given the severe risks of food security crises, that is not a reason to not go forward and develop GMO technologies, which is why certain activists, particularly in the European Environment Agency, developed something 20 years ago. We have the anniversary this year, from the book from the European Environment Agency, official advisory body of the European Union, that they came up with the first issue of Late Lessons from Early Warnings, where they changed the precautionary principle a bit. They moved from the triple negative to rather the reversal of the burden of proof, not where you would have a new technology and then you'd have to prove that it was in some way dangerous, but rather before you're allowed to bring a new technology on, you had to prove that it was safe. So you have two emotional concepts coming into a scientific process. First is certainty. And of course, certainty is something that every scientist knows. Kevin, you can probably join on this, which is quite relative. And then the second thing is safety. And this is something that, as precaution has been used more and more in Brussels towards this approach, we're beginning to see that regulators have taken on a new sort of nanny-like approach to say that we are going to keep our citizens safe. Well, what is safe? And that's not only an emotional concept, but it's also quite a dangerous one, because it's not risk management. Precaution has replaced risk management. It's not at all. Normally, precaution should come at the end. I try to manage the risk. If I can't manage the risk, then I take precaution. Now it's until you can show me this is safe, you can't have a market. You can't bring this product out. You can't bring this technology out. And we saw this in particular with the coronavirus lockdowns, that the idea was until you were safe, we're going to lock you down. And that, of course, meant constantly coming back into waves again that we're not safe on. We saw that when there was a few cases of blood clots from the AstraZeneca vaccine, that we suspended the use of that until we could be certain. Now, you're never going to be certain with a vaccine of 100% safety. So this idea of safe has become the new measure, which from a scientific perspective doesn't work. Risk management is about safer, reducing exposure and making the situation safer. How safe is enough? Well, that's as low as reasonably achievable. It's something reasonable. Precaution is not about that now. At least the David G. European Environment Agency use of precaution, which is until you can prove to me with certainty that this is safe, go away. And unfortunately, a lot of innovations just will never see the light of day because of this.
Yeah, very sad conclusion. Thanks, David. Looking at the time, I'm afraid that's all that we have for today. And for me, these 30 minutes flew by super fast. I have the feeling that we didn't even make a dent in the number of topics that we could have covered.
Didn't even disagree much.
True. Why don't we make a plan to meet again next week at Seed World International? Are you guys up for that?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's always good to talk. Always good to see David.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Kevin and David. And thanks to our audience for listening. I hope you found it interesting and valuable. And stay tuned for the sequel.